From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power with David Weston.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Well, the world took note overnight as the Bank of Japan announced that it would double the upper limit on its 10-year bond up to 0.5%, something that surprised everything by the governor, Mr. Kuroda. We had heard earlier today from Mohammed El-Arian of Bloomberg Opinion in Queens College, Cambridge, that he thinks that might be the start of something.
There's no doubt in my mind that this is the step towards normalization. The good news for them is I think they can control the process. That's actually good news for global markets because it doesn't force selling by Japanese institutions. However, over time, even this approach becomes unsustainable.
We welcome now Bloomberg reporter Chris Anstey, who spent 11 years in Tokyo for Bloomberg, including heading its Asia economy and government coverage. So Chris, thanks so much for being with us. Do you think Mohammed El-Arian is right? Is this the start of something moving toward normalization for the Bank of Japan?
I think he's exactly right, David. The main challenge for the Bank of Japan for some time now is how to make their stimulus, their ultra easing stance sustainable. They own a bigger and bigger proportion of the Japanese bond market, and the negative consequences of their ultra-stimulative policy have become increasingly clear. The yen heading to the weakest on a inflation-adjusted basis ever. You've had damage to the current account. You've had damage to household purchasing power. So the negatives have been piling up. They've known for some time they need to put this thing on a more sustainable basis. And this little tweak to the yield curve regime is the first step towards a more sustainable policy.
Chris, you know Bank of Japan very well. Mr. Kuroda, of course, is not going to be there, as I understand it, after April. He'll have a successor. What does this do for his successor? How does it set him up specifically toward possible rate increases?
Well, there was an interesting little tidbit from our Tokyo crew that actually is a bit Machiavellian, thinking that the Bank of Japan folks, including Governor Kuroda, might have made this tweak in order to encourage the government to not pick someone who's going to entirely upend Kuroda's legacy of big stimulus here. What this does is to give the Bank of Japan's successor in the governor position more leeway to take a more incremental approach than a big shift next spring.
That's a fascinating read. Thank you so much. Good to have you with us. That's Chris Anstey of Bloomberg News. And now we welcome Jack Lew, managing partner in Lindsay Goldberg. Mr. Lew, of course, served as Treasury Secretary under President Obama. So welcome. It's great to have you here, Jack.
Great to be with you, David.
So let's start with the Bank of Japan. What did you make out of this move?
Well, obviously, it was a big surprise. There wasn't a lot of telescoping that the move was coming. I'd be a little bit more cautious in terms of predicting exactly where it goes because Japan has some very significant issues that are hard to address. They worry about long-term deflation, not inflation. They've had a hard time getting their economy to be as vibrant as they want it to be. And they have tolerated a lot of debt, with most of it held domestically, so it hasn't had the kind of negative ramifications it might have if it were more broadly traded on international markets. I do think it's a move, but I think they have a long ways to go before the gap between their interest rates and normal interest rates in the United States, for example, are anywhere close. So I think one can exaggerate how much it will mean. Certainly on the margin, it's going to move things, but I don't know that it's going to fundamentally reshape how the world looks.
Well, perhaps the first move we saw was, of course, foreign exchange and what it did to the yen, which had been so weak, to strengthen it somewhat because it had been so weak, particularly against the dollar. Going back to the days when you were Treasury Secretary, how would you have reacted to this sort of move? I guess you had a different regime back then.
Well, I was looking at the opposite. We worried that they might try to weaken the yen to gain unfair advantage in terms of exporting into our market. And we frequently had fairly difficult conversations about what our response to that would be and how it would be a real challenge in the relationship. What's happened in the last year is that the rapid decline in the value of the yen has really created a lot of pressure internally within Japan, 30% plus devaluation against the dollar in the last recent period. And it's kind of beyond what they would have ever wanted. Now, I don't think that means they want the yen to get very strong. They still want to generally be able to have advantage in export markets. So they've got to find a balance. Fundamentally, I think they have to worry about the domestic condition of the Japanese economy and let the international issues kind of settle out.
So let's turn to the international issues. Whether this has broad ramifications or not, we're seeing central bank tightening in much of the developed world, certainly led perhaps by the Federal Reserve. A lot of concern right now about a possible global recession. How do you see it?
You know, when I look around the world, it's hard to answer the question with just one simple generalization, because I think our economy is in a very different place in Europe and China. And I think if you look at our economy, I'm still in the slightly optimistic camp that our exit from the COVID policies, both financial and fiscal, can lead to continued growth, or if there is a slowdown and a recession, a very shallow one. I'm not one of the people who thinks we're about to go off the cliff, but partially that's rooted in a confidence that I have that the Fed is trying very carefully to measure what it does not to have that result. You know, it could be that they end up having to go farther and the recession ends up coming the way some fear it will and be deeper. But to me, that's not the base case. So I think the United States will be softer, but, you know, emerge pretty strong. Europe, I think, starts out in a weaker place. They went into COVID in a weaker place. They have a war that's in Europe that's very much affecting their economy and inflation. They're going to have to go harder on some of the results that creates in terms of the value of the inflation and what that means in terms of the interest rate policy. You look to China, we counted on China in the last big recession to help be an engine for the global recovery. I think that's less likely this time. They're going to have a hard time sustaining, a 3 to 5% growth rate. They're not going to be growing at 6 to 10%, and they may get to a slower growth rate than that. The very rapid change of policy on COVID is going to lead to an awful lot of illness, I believe, in China. I hope that they can control the number of people who die, but that has economic ramifications in terms of people showing up for work, as we know so well when we had the waves of COVID here. So I think that China is both in a situation where economic policies have been constraining to growth, and now the health situation is going to be a slowing, not an accelerating factor.
Well, talk about that balance between economic policy on the one hand and the health on the other. What levers does China have? What buttons do they have to push, perhaps, on the economic front to really make up for some of the shortcoming on the health side?
Well, interestingly, what they've been talking about recently, according to reports, is stimulating consumer demand. I can't tell you how many times in bilateral meetings I urge China to stimulate domestic consumption. Don't put all of your resources behind the industrial policies that are creating frictions between us. If they move in that direction, I think it will be helpful. I'm not sure that the policies will follow. They have a tried and true method of generating big projects and investment initiatives. And they're actually pretty good at it, but they're running out of things to invest in that regard. So I'm hoping that there will be some modest reform there in terms of balancing. And in a society where the consumer spending is not driving the economy as much as it does in, say, our own economy, that would be a good thing. I think the health thing is going to be a big issue. I think it's going to slow things down. You know, I've heard conflicting views as to whether or not it becomes a global supply chain crisis. It doesn't have to become a global supply chain crisis to slow down China's economic activity.
One last one, Jack, and that is we saw China grow more than any economy, perhaps in the history of the world, so quickly. But that was when the United States was either encouraging or benign. Now there's some rivalry there. How much of that is a friction cost in further growth for China, or for that matter, for the global economy?
Look, I think there is friction cost in the economic and geopolitical tension between the U.S. and China. I don't think it's going to go away quickly, and I hope after the meeting between our two presidents that it can be managed in a way that contains the economic and geopolitical risk that comes from that competition. I think that if we continue to put pressure on China's economy in a way that's clearly designed to deal with strategic issues, it's very different than if we're perceived as generally closing down to China. And there's a thin line between the two. I think, some of the policies that have been put in place, as I've learned more about them, are actually crafted pretty well to draw that line in a way that is, I think, justifiable. But you can easily move it a little bit, and then the tension becomes much worse. And it's not just the administration, it's Congress forming a committee now on China and what's going to come of that. I hope it stays in a place where it's managed. The two leaders meeting has set in motion a higher level of engagement. That's a good thing. We didn't have enough engagement before. It's very important to both of our countries and to the world that we manage the issues we have and find ways we can cooperate on things like climate.
Yeah, the two largest economies, after all. Yeah. Thank you so much, Jack. It's always such a treat to have you with us. That is Jack Lew, former U.S. Treasury Secretary. Coming up, can Ukraine win its war with Russia? We're going to ask retired U.S. Army Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. More drone strikes in Ukraine overnight, these in Kyiv, although a lot of the drones were intercepted as the Russians continue their relentless attack, particularly on the power grid in Ukraine. To bring us up to speed on where we are in the war in Ukraine, we welcome now retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, who served as the commanding general, U.S. Army Europe. He is now senior advisor at Human Rights First. So, General, thank you so much for being back with us. We did have these reports. A lot of the drones get shot down. Not all of them get shot down. Some of them make it through. Give us your sense of this drone war, which is what it's turning into to some extent.
Well, of course, the Russians are attempting to string out this conflict for as long as they can in hopes that the West will lose the will to keep supporting Ukraine. And so the drone strikes are intended to put thousands of Ukrainian refugees on the road into Europe, which will put pressure on European capitals to then put pressure on Kyiv, but they're also trying to destroy Ukraine's ability to conduct the war, to knock out the power necessary to run the trains, for example, factories, those sorts of things. So these are clear war crimes. We know that, to target civilian infrastructure. And at some point, the International Criminal Court in The Hague is going to hold them accountable.
But sadly, often that takes some time, as I recall, General, to have that International Criminal Court really address it. In the meantime, what can the West, the United States and NATO allies do to support Ukraine through this winter?
Well, first of all, the administration has got to say, we want Ukraine to win. This administration has done a terrific job keeping the alliance together, providing so much capability to Ukraine that's essential, but they haven't gone that last step to say we want Ukraine to win. And I think it's because they have deterred themselves, over-concerned about how Russia might escalate. And they've also, I think, decided that Ukraine does not have the ability to push the Russians out of Crimea, and so therefore it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. They won't provide what's needed to help Ukraine push the Russians out of Crimea. And without Crimea being returned completely to Ukrainian sovereignty, there never will be stability and security for Ukraine. Personally, I believe that the Pentagon assessment is wrong. The White House is wrong in this case. I think that Ukraine can liberate Crimea by the end of next summer, so by the end of August, if we provide the long-range precision weapons like the ATACMS that could continue to knock out the logistics that Russian forces require.
So, General, we hear a lot, we civilians, about the war games that you and the military conduct. So do a little war game for us here. Let's assume you're right, and in fact, Ukraine could actually win the war with Russia by the end of next summer. How do they get there?
So if you look at a map of Crimea, there are only two roads that go in there that bring in resupply, reinforcements, new equipment. One of them, of course, goes over the famous Kerch Bridge, which connects Crimea to the Russian mainland. The other is the so-called land bridge that runs from Rostov through Mariupol and Melitopol along the coast of Sea of Azov into Crimea. Kerch Bridge has already been severely damaged. It's going to be weeks before it's able to function properly again. And the land bridge is already being attacked by Ukrainian forces. So they are already able to block or disrupt the two main land routes into Crimea. That's the key. If they had the ATACMS, the longer range weapon system, they could be hitting Russian air bases, Navy bases, and ammunition sites on Crimea already. So the solution is not just a frontal attack like in the Second World War into Crimea. It's going to be the degradation of logistics, command and control, and making Crimea untenable for the Russian Air Force and Navy.
So if that happens, does that actually allow the Ukrainians to expel Russians from the territory they've gained in eastern Ukraine? I mean, how do you define winning for the Ukrainians?
So total restoration of sovereignty over all Ukrainian territory is the key part, and that has to include Crimea. Without Crimea, they'll never have stability and security. They'll never be able to rebuild the ports of Berdyansk and Mariupol, which are essential for them exporting grain through Sea of Azov. And of course, if the Russians still control Crimea, they'll be able to interdict anything coming in or out of Odessa. And so that's why this is so important. Now, the other part of the so-called Donbass region is important, but not as important as Crimea. And I think eventually they will expel those forces out as well. So that's the first part. The second part is the return of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian citizens, particularly children, that have been deported out of Ukraine and scattered across Russia. These people have to be brought back home to Ukraine. And then the third part, of course, is Ukraine's long-term security prospects. The United States is doing a lot to help them with a long-term view once we've gotten Ukrainian territory and sovereignty reestablished.
So, General, I'm actually getting a question from a viewer right now who says that, in fact, we may not be getting the full story about the cost being paid in casualties for Ukrainians. It could have been as many as 100,000 soldiers lost and 20,000 civilians. I don't know if those numbers are right or not, but do you think we're getting an accurate read on the price that Ukrainians are paying right now?
Well, I think that the Ukrainians are going to be much more forthcoming about their casualties than are the Russians. The Russian casualties, we think, the Pentagon agrees, are around 100,000 killed, and usually the normal math is 2 or 3 to 1 in terms of wounded. So you're talking about a significant number of Russian soldiers that have been killed or wounded. On the Ukrainian side, my assessment is that probably about a third to a half of those numbers are Ukrainian casualties, killed, wounded, and so on. For the Ukrainian side, though, they've already got about 700,000 troops in uniform. That's Army, National Guard, Territorial Defense Forces, and there's probably another 2 million women and men military age that are prepared to step forward. So manpower is not the issue for Ukraine. It is, surprisingly, a real problem for the Russian side.
So finally, General, I'm really struck by the fact that you think the Pentagon may be underestimating the odds, the chances of a success for the Ukrainians. And by the way, if they succeed, we succeed as well. If that's right, where are they making the mistake? Why are they wrong about that? These are, as you know, some pretty smart people doing their job the best they can.
Yeah, they're exceptionally talented, intelligent people. I know many of them, and certainly, they will have reasons for their assessment. But I think the two things that are the two reasons I disagree with them is that their belief that the Ukrainians cannot possibly have the ability to push Russian forces out of Crimea. And if we don't provide them what they need, then it does become a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's number one. Number two, the risk of nuclear war, of the Russians using a tactical nuclear device. Of course you take that seriously. They have thousands of them, but I think that the Russians believe President Biden. They believe it when he says there will be catastrophic consequences if they use a nuclear weapon. And I think the people around Putin believe that, and that's why, and it gives them no battlefield advantage, by the way. That's why I don't believe they'll actually use a nuclear weapon.
General, it's always such a pleasure to have you with us, and you really help us understand it better. Thank you so much. It's retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. Still to come, we're going to talk to Republican Senator Rick Scott of Florida about that omnibus spending bill they're trying to pass before the holidays. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on Bloomberg Radio.
The top names at the Fed are on Bloomberg.
I do see growth slowing, but remember, that's part of the mechanism of getting demand into better balance with supply and alleviating those price pressures.
We're clearly not in a recession right now based on the data. It is an economy that is growing only modestly, and I think it's an economy that's really seeing the imbalances between supply and demand diminishing and inflation coming down.
Nobody covers the Fed like Bloomberg, your global business authority.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David West. And when it comes to the markets, we're talking about the Bank of Japan and its big surprise move today. And to take us through what that has done to the markets, welcome now Kriti Gupta. So, Kriti, where are we?
Well, we'll start with the initial market reaction. It was most notable on the long end of the curve. This idea here that if you were starting to see Japanese yields kind of get some breathing room coming off of this band widening of an upper bound of about 0.5%, that means that essentially those inflationary pressures that are moving yields higher globally, well, they're going to follow in tandem with the Japanese, with the JGB market, I should say, with the Japanese bond market. So you're seeing that in the long end of the curve. The 10-year yield, for example, 368, a 10 basis point move higher. I actually heard this morning that some of the bond movement yesterday as well, also a 10 basis point move, was because of rumblings that this might actually happen overnight. So it looks like this is almost a 2-day move that you're seeing, a 20 basis point move in 2 days, which is nothing to scoff at in the bond market. A similar story in the currency market, because as we see those yields go higher, the Japanese yen really strengthens. And that's important coming in the context of the dollar, which has already been weakening across all of the major currencies. Now to weaken by this much against the Japanese yen is also significant. I would argue the kind of tick-by-tick moves lower in the dollar, perhaps driving some of the tick-by-tick moves higher in the S&P 500.
Just my question, because we saw it in the FX, you'd expect it in currency, and we saw it in the longer end of the bond market. We haven't seen it. When I first came in early this morning, they thought that the U.S. equities would sell off, actually, on this.
Yeah, and follow the pain in the Asian market as well. And this is really crucial because overnight in the Asian market, they did sell off because they thought this is a one-off situation, that this isn't going to be sustainable at the end of the day, as something that did kind of seep into sentiment around the world. But the problem here is that Japan kind of is doing its own thing anyway. The difference, though, is if you actually look at some of the Japanese ETFs, for example, they were actually positive. And that's because a lot of these people are using those ETFs to short the Japanese market. So they buy into it. It's kind of a wonky market scenario.
It's fascinating. It's not wonky. It's fascinating. Thank you so much to Kriti Gupta. You can catch Kriti again at 1 p.m. Eastern Time when she's going to be anchoring Bloomberg Markets. Coming up, the crisis on the southern border. We're going to talk with former Secretary of Homeland Security Janet Napolitano about what needs to be done. And this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on Bloomberg Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David West, and now to keep you up to date with news from all around the world, we turn to Mark Crumpton here with the first word.
David, thank you. In the Bahamas, Sam Bankman-Fried's potential extradition to the United States is in flux today. A court said it wasn't immediately holding a hearing on the co-founder of the collapsed cryptocurrency empire. Bankman-Fried has been locked up since last week when U.S. authorities brought fraud charges against him. His lawyer says he will no longer fight extradition. In a new Bloomberg poll, economists say there is a 7 in 10 likelihood that the U.S. economy will sink into a recession next year. That's more than double what it was 6 months ago. Estimates call for gross domestic product to rise 0.3%. Meantime, consumer spending, which accounts for about 2/3 of GDP, is expected to barely grow in the middle half of the year. China is adding weight to the speculation that it's hiding the true picture of how many people have died since the end of the COVID-0 policy. Health officials confirm they have narrowed how they define a death caused by COVID. Only those people who tested positive for COVID and died of respiratory failure will be considered a virus death. Ukraine has reached a deal with Elon Musk's SpaceX to receive thousands more Starlink antennas. They'll be used to counter Russian air attacks. More than 10,000 of the antennas will be sent to Ukraine in the coming months. They provide internet service beamed from the satellites. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, thousands of people are coming across the southern border, and there are reports of thousands more waiting as the expiration approaches on that Title 42 exemption because of health concerns. And the question is, what can be done about it? What should be done about it? To give us some answers to that, we welcome now Janet Napolitano, who served as Secretary of Homeland Security under President Obama after her service as governor of Arizona. So, Madam Secretary, thank you so much for being here. We are watching this. Reports this morning, there are like 20,000 people south of the border about to pour over the border. It looks like a mess to most of us. What can be done about it?
Well, first of all, there needs to be a logistical plan for how to handle all of these potential asylees. There needs to be a plan for shelter along the border, a plan to keep families together where that's possible, and a plan to move people away from the border to other places in the United States where they can be reunited with family members while they wait for their asylum hearings.
So do we have the person power to do that? Because it's a matter of border guards as well as hearing officers and as you say, a lot of facilities to house these people.
Right. Good question. Hopefully, the Department of Homeland Security has been staffing up. They may need to detail people from other areas of the department to the border. I think the important thing is to reassure the American people that the border is being protected, that there is a plan to handle all these potential asylees. But I'll tell you, one of the problems that this illustrates is just the fact that our whole asylum system and immigration system as a whole needs reform. I think that Congress has been stuck on this for far too long.
Well, it certainly seems to be true, and we don't seem to be having any solutions coming down the pike. I wonder specifically about the national security implications here, because you have reports that there are cartels south of the border that are really involved in some of this asylum seeking. In fact, we have things like illegal drugs coming across the border and a lot of criminals potentially. Now, I'm not saying all of them are by any means, but enough.
Right. The vast majority are not criminals. They are people simply seeking a safe and secure place to live. But there is cartel activity. Now, most of the illegal drugs that come through the border actually come through the ports of entry. And particularly where fentanyl is concerned, it's easily hidden in trucks and cars. And there are thousands of those that go through our ports every day. And Customs is pretty good at finding these illegal narcotics, but they can't find them all.
Let me turn to another subject you've been very involved in, that's election security. We've just had a midterm election, and I will say from my point of view, there were not nearly the number of instances that many people expected of claims of something going wrong with the election process. But give me your perspective, because you really follow this closely. How did we do?
Yeah, I think we did pretty well. I think the one place where there's been some post-election contentions is my old state of Arizona, where there were problems with tabulating the ballots in Maricopa County. Now, nobody was denied the right to vote. There were secure backup places for the ballots, which the Republican-controlled board that supervises the elections have been quick to point out. But the losing gubernatorial Republican, Kari Lake, is raising a ruckus about it.
So exactly. Let's talk about Kari Lake from your old home state who ran for governor. And she has sued, as I understand, some of those claims have been thrown out. But is there merit to her suit from what you understand of what's going on?
No, there's no merit to it. Her complaint is a 70-page mishmash of contentions that go all the way back to the 2020 election. She's just not happy. She lost, and she's not happy about it, but she needs to concede. And the Democrat who won, Katie Hobbs, is already engaged in her transition, as it should be. So
let's look forward, if we could, to 2024. What have we learned from 20 and 22 that could help us do a better job in 24? Because we can always do a better job. We can always do a better job. I think the important thing is to
make sure that elections are run by people who are trained, and that training actually starts now, because a presidential election, normally a very heavy turnout, and we don't want the same kinds of questions raised about it that were raised facetiously about the 2020 election. A
fair number of people, though, who ran for office this last time in the midterms really continue to claim that the 2020 election was wrongly decided, right? Is there a danger in 2024 that they may be in positions that they could really raise questions? I'm talking about the state level now, governors, secretaries of state.
Right. Most of those so-called election deniers who ran in the battleground states, they all lost. They are not going to be in positions to unduly influence how the votes are counted and certified. But, there are some who won primarily in deep red states where theoretically they can't have that much of an impact on the result. But the battleground states, I think we can be assured that the election deniers are not going to be in a place to influence the election.
One of the issues, as you know, Madam Secretary, has been sort of absentee ballots or early voting in various states. Arizona, as I recall, has been an early adopter of that and has been adopting it for quite some time now. Does that increase the reliability of elections? Does it undermine it? Because some people claim that really raises some questions about their legitimacy.
No, and states like Arizona have been running vote by mail for years with no problems. And, the thing is, you actually have a paper ballot. You actually have a signature that can be matched. There's, it's almost in a way not only as secure, but in a way more secure. And, in California, where I live now, everybody gets a vote by mail ballot. Once you sign up for it, you get it for every election. And it makes voting easier. It makes it more convenient. It gives people time. When you have these very long state ballots that have, office contentions and referenda and initiatives, having time to actually study your ballot and fill it out it's a great help to the voter.
Okay, Madam Secretary, thank you so much. We always enjoy having you with us. That's Janet Napolitano, former governor of Arizona and also former Secretary of Homeland Security. Coming up, we're going to get to talk to Republican Senator Rick Scott of Florida about the recommendations of the House January 6th committee and his views on the security risks from TikTok. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Well, yesterday we got the final report from that select committee looking into the events of January 6th. And the vice chair of that committee, Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney, gave her views of what they found. This is what she said.
In addition to being unlawful, as described in our report, this was an utter moral failure and a clear dereliction of duty. No man who would behave that way at that moment in time can ever serve in any position of authority in our nation again. He is unfit for any office.
We welcome now Senator Rick Scott, Republican of Florida. So, Senator, you're in the Senate, not the House, but I'm curious what your reaction is to that report. What should we make of it, do you think?
Well, first off, it's always been political theater. It was not a normally created committee. Any investigation ought to be done by law enforcement. So this is just political theater. We ought to let law enforcement do their job and not let some political theater out of the House try to influence the next election. The voters are going to decide who the next president is. We don't need somebody in the House trying to figure that out.
From what you know, Senator, did they get the facts wrong?
Well, I mean, the problem is it was just all anti-Trump. I mean, there's so many things we need to know. We need to know, what our other law enforcement agents were doing. Why did we have more security that day? There's a lot. They didn't even care about those issues. I mean, I think those are legitimate issues that we ought to know. I was here. I mean, I'd like to know why we didn't have more security that day. I want to know what the FBI was doing that day. There's so much we should know that they didn't care about.
There's a lot left to know, no question about it. But just one last one. If, in fact, what they said about the former president was true, do you think it's a crime?
I think we ought to leave it to Department of Justice to deal with these issues. But ultimately, you know who's going to decide the issues is the voters. Yeah. We know the former president's running again, and the voters are going to have a choice to make a decision.
And in the meantime, what you're going to decide, along with the other members of Congress, is on this omnibus spending bill. Give us a sense of where that is right now, where you think it's going.
Well, we received it at 128 this morning. It's been negotiated by just a few people in the dark. It's 3 times the size of the Bible. We're going to be expected to read this and understand what's in it. It's got 7,500 earmarks. So, I mean, it's tough for me because I like to read what I'm going to vote on. I mean, would you elect somebody or hire somebody that told you to sign a document they'd never even read? That's what I've been expected to do. They're going to try to rush this week. The government gets shut down Friday night. I don't know why we don't just pass regular budgets here. So I'm going to read it. We'll make a decision what I'm going to do. But, I mean, it's not the way your government ought to be working. So it's borrowed money, David. It's not like we have money in the bank. We got $31.5 trillion of debt. We're running trillion-plus deficits. I mean, someday there's accountability here. That's why we have this inflation. Yeah, we're going to have somebody on from the Penn Wharton budget model in the next hour actually talking about that debt and how big it might get. But in the meantime, given what you just said, the need to read through all that thing and the deadline at the same time, are you going to make the deadline of December 23rd? Are you going to get something passed by then? I don't know. It's up to the Democrats. They control the agenda. It's up to Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi if they want to get something done or not. I'm going to do my job. I'm going to read the bill, try to understand what's in it, understand why we have 7,500 earmarks, why we get these things at the last minute, and why don't the Democrats care about how much debt we have in these deficits? I don't, and how many families are getting hurt by this inflation. Let me turn to another subject I know that you've talked a fair amount about, and that's TikTok, that Chinese social media outlet that a lot of people question about for purposes of national security. First of all, where are we on the national security review? I thought there was one ongoing about exactly what risk they might pose. That's also my understanding. I personally haven't seen that. Right now, hopefully, we're going to say that you can't have TikTok on any federal devices. Hopefully, we'll get that passed. Anything that the Communist Party of China has control over, it's bad for us. I mean, they've decided to be our adversary. They're trying to build a military to be able to defeat us. They lied about COVID. They weren't a partner on anything. There's nothing they do that's good for us. It's all bad for us, and TikTok's just part of it. So Senator, as you say, Chinese drones, David, all that. So as you say, Senator, as I understand, first there was a ban on military devices having TikTok on it. Now there is a proposal that may well get enacted here before you're out of Congress to apply to all government devices. What about beyond that, to private devices? Should we be trying to ban everybody in the United States from using this? And if so, is that doable? Well, clearly everything like that is doable. I think the next thing is every parent's got to start looking at what TikTok does. I mean, it's toxic. It's not good for anybody, and it's toxic to our teenagers. And it's hard to get rid of these things. But I mean, we have to understand Chinese drones where they surveil us, TikTok where they have information about us. All these things are bad for Americans. And so at some point, all of us are going to have to come together and say, you know what? Communist China, the party in Communist China has decided to be our enemy, our adversary. So we can't buy anything made in Communist China. We're going to have to decouple. We don't really have a choice. We can't rely on them for drugs, anything. Boy, that's fascinating. You think we should actually just ban purchasing anything from China? What would that do to our economy? Wouldn't that hurt us? Well, I believe in the ingenuity of American workers. I think it'll actually bring American jobs back here. Also, we can work with our allies. But we're going to have to come to our senses over what Communist China is. They've decided to be our adversary. They want to dominate us. Somebody that wants to be your adversary, would you buy drugs from them? Would you be reliant on them for anything that's important to you? I wouldn't. I want to be independent of Communist China. Okay, Senator, thank you so much for coming back on with us, and we hope you have a good holiday whenever you get to it. That is Senator Rick Scott, Republican of Florida. Coming up next, we're going to talk about what's going on up on Capitol Hill with our Washington correspondent. He's Mr. Joe Matthew. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westing. We're getting down to the final days before the holiday break, but Congress still has a fair amount of work to do. We turn now to Washington correspondent Joe Matthew. He's host of Sound On weekdays on Bloomberg Radio. Joe, thanks so much for being with us. We just talked to Rick Scott, senator from Florida, about the omnibus spending bill. Where does that stand from your reporting?
Well, we actually have one. For starters, the bill dropped overnight. It dropped after midnight as budget writers took several days to put this together. We've talked about this at least in part, David, the $1.7 trillion top line. We knew about that. As you take a look inside, it is 4,000 pages long, 4,155 to be exact. So I don't know how many lawmakers are going to have a chance to read this whole thing before they head off for the holidays. But it does include some of the headlines, a roughly 10% increase in defense spending. There is a supplemental $45 billion chunk here for the war in Ukraine as well. Both of those were important to both sides here. Further on down, there are a couple of noteworthy items that were attached, David. One of them is the Electoral Count Act to prevent another January 6th from happening. And the other is a ban on TikTok on government-owned phones and devices. They both made the cut here, but it was neither of those that kept this going late into the evening that actually delayed things here. That was over an argument to relocate the FBI headquarters. The delegations from Maryland and Virginia are both fighting for this. And of course, I don't need to remind you, the current FBI headquarters on Pennsylvania Avenue is one of the ugliest buildings in the nation's capital. So they're going to one place or the other here. And there was a compromise, David, to have the GSA specifically consult with both sides to help make the decision based on FBI mission and equity. So stay tuned on that. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, and it has nothing at all to do with the amount of commerce that might be associated around that headquarters, depending on where it ends up, right? That would be totally irrelevant. Well, so I won't disagree with you about the ugliness of the FBI headquarters. That sounds right to me. At the same time, we've got another issue pending, as I understand, maybe right now before the House Ways and Means Committee, and that is the infamous Donald Trump tax returns.
Yeah, this has turned out to be an incredibly busy week for the final throes of the year here. But you're right. The House Ways and Means Committee is going to vote later on today. They're going to do this behind closed doors. It'll happen late in the afternoon, and it could ride into the evening for an actual vote. And we're pretty sure we know how this is going to end up with our Democrat majority in the House. A vote to release, to actually make public at least portions, if not the entire 6 years worth of Donald Trump's tax returns. David, we've been covering this story since this request went in some time ago, but for years, people have been trying to get their hands on Trump's tax returns. So some folks are kind of finding this hard to believe. But it'll be interesting to see what's redacted and what is kept in here for the public eye. Speaker Pelosi does support this for what it's worth. Richie Neal, the chair of House Ways and Means, doesn't have much time to get this done here. But once it's out, it's out. And there'll be questions on what he's paying for taxes, David. And also, is Donald Trump as wealthy as he claims to be?
That may be the most sensitive part of the whole story before we're done here, Joe. So finally, okay, that's what they may get done here before they're out of town. What's left over for perhaps Kevin McCarthy if he gets to be Speaker of the House? Because he's going to have a narrow majority, and there's some thorny questions left behind.
Well, that's true. Look, we don't know if Kevin McCarthy is even going to be the speaker. This is going to be the big story of the new year when we come back from the holidays here. Can he get the 218 votes required to take the gavel? There are at least 5 Republican hard no's, and at a conservative Republican confab this week, the America Fest, Matt Gaetz, Lauren Boebert, and others were saying hard no. So there are questions about whether Steve Scalise could emerge from behind. David, this is going to be a major piece of drama in the House to start the new year.
Well, we can look forward to that in the new year. We're reporting from you, actually, Joe, is what we're looking forward to. That's Joe Matthew. He's host of Sound On every day of the week at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Radio. Check out the Balance of Power newsletter on the terminal and also online. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we're going to talk to retired federal district court judge. She is Nancy Gertner about the legal effects of the January 6th committee's recommendations. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg.